Stop right there. HOA authority. A woman in a reflective vest. Palm flat on the hood of my truck. Behind her, two guys in matching polo shirts, laminated badges, clipboards. People she hired. To stop me. In front of my own driveway. HOA authority. Like that's a thing. I'm sitting behind the wheel. Engine running. Nowhere to go. This woman had been coming after me for 2 years. Fake fines. Made up rules. Threatened to lean my home over a toolbox in a truck bed. And when none of it broke me, she built herself a fake police force and sent them to finish the job. What she forgot to check was what was already turning the corner behind me. A United States Army convoy, 7 vehicles, loaded, filling the entire road, and they needed it clear, right now. Fake HOA police in front of me, the US military behind me. She turned around, and that clipboard dropped. Those soldiers didn't just clear the road, they surrounded every single one of them, right there, in front of the whole neighborhood. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And have you ever done everything right and still had someone come after you anyway? HOA Karen sent fake HOA police to stop me. Let me take you back about 2 years, to a small but proud planned community called Ridgecrest Pines, nestled in the hill country of central Texas, about 40 miles outside of Austin. Think cedar trees, caliche driveways, the faint smell of cedar smoke on cool mornings, and enough pride in property lines to make a surveyor weep with joy. I'm Garrett, former Army logistics sergeant, 15 years in, now running a small welding and fabrication shop out of a rented commercial bay 12 minutes from my house. I'd moved to Ridgecrest Pines 2 years earlier with my wife, Donna, and our teenage son, Cole. The HOA dues were $180 a month. The neighbors were mostly decent, and the rules, on paper, were reasonable. Keep your lawn trimmed. No RVs parked visible from the street. No painting your house safety cone orange. Simple enough, right? Now let me introduce you to Phyllis Drummond. Phyllis was the self-appointed, and then formally elected, mostly by running unopposed, president of the Ridgecrest Pines Homeowners Association. She'd lived on the corner lot at the entrance of the neighborhood for 11 years, which in HOA land apparently translates to something close to divine right of kings. Phyllis was in her early 60s, wore visors year-round, even indoors, and had a smile that landed somewhere between a real estate agent and a courtroom prosecutor. She drove a pearl-white Lexus SUV she treated like a second child, and she carried a clipboard the way a conductor carries a baton, like it was an instrument of pure authority. I first noticed her watching me the week we moved in, not waving, not introducing herself, watching. Standing at the end of her driveway with that clipboard, making notes. The crunch of gravel under the moving truck tires seemed to irritate her personally, like each stone was a personal affront. The first official notice arrived 11 days after we closed on the house. A printed letter in a manila envelope, stamped with the HOA seal, which was just a clip art pine tree, informing me that my truck, a 2019 F250 with a commercial-grade toolbox in the bed, was classified as a commercial vehicle under Section 4.2 of the Ridgecrest Pines CC and RS, and was therefore prohibited from being parked in my driveway, that I own. I read Section 4.2 twice. It said nothing about personal trucks with toolboxes. It said nothing about vehicles under 1 ton. My truck wasn't even technically over 1 ton. But Phyllis had appointed herself the sole interpreter of all covenant language, and her interpretation was final, at least in her mind. I wrote a polite letter back, cited the actual language, got a second letter that said my letter had been noted, but the violation stood. I spoke to 2 other neighbors, a retired firefighter named Harlan and a younger couple, the Vespers, who'd been there 3 years, and every single one of them had a Phyllis story. Harlan got cited for his American flag being 12 inches too low on his flagpole. The Vespers got fined because their holiday decorations were still up on January 7th, 1 day past the HOA's self-imposed December 31st removal deadline, a deadline that incidentally did not appear anywhere in the actual CC&Rs. The pattern was obvious once you looked. Phyllis targeted people who were new, working class, or who she simply didn't like. She had favorites. The attorneys, the retirees with money, the people who brought her baked goods to the quarterly meeting. Those folks never got letters. Their boats sat in driveways all summer. Their fences went up without permits. This wasn't enforcement. This was performance. and I was being cast as the villain in her little neighborhood play. The truck letter was just the opening act. I didn't know it yet, but Phyllis had bigger plans. And so, eventually, did I. The second letter became a third. The third became a fourth. Each one escalating slightly. A new violation bolted on like a new accessory on a bad used car. First, the truck. Then the toolbox brackets on the truck, which Phyllis claimed were exposed commercial equipment visible from the street. Then the small utility trailer I occasionally parked on the side of the house, barely visible behind a cedar hedge. I hired an attorney, not a big gun, just a sharp local guy named Walt Cordero, who charged $200 an hour and had a reputation for eating HOA boards for breakfast. Walt read through the CC and Rs in about 45 minutes and called me back with a tone of restrained delight. "Garrett," he said, "about 60% of what she's citing either doesn't exist in this document or is being deliberately misread. This woman is running a game." Walt drafted a formal response to each violation, citing the actual CC and R section numbers, the actual language, and a polite but steel-spined note that any future enforcement attempts based on misrepresented covenant language would be considered harassment under Texas Property Code, Section 200-2.004. That's the legal hook right there, and you can Google it yourself. Texas 200-2.004. It prohibits HOA boards from selectively or arbitrarily enforcing rules. If they let your neighbor's boat sit out but fine you for a toolbox, that's a violation of the law, not just a personality conflict. Takeaway: selective HOA enforcement isn't just unfair. In Texas and many other states, it's illegal under state property code. The day after Walt's letter landed in Phyllis's mailbox, she showed up at my door. Not the mailbox, the door. I opened it, and she stood there in her visor and cream-colored linen blazer, clipboard in hand, with that prosecutorial smile dialed up to full wattage. "Garrett," she said, like we were old friends, "I just want to resolve this neighborly." Neighborly would have been a conversation before the letters, I said. She smiled wider, that smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "The violations are what they are, but maybe there's a path forward if you were willing to get more involved in the community." I waited. "The beautification committee has a co-chair opening," she said. "It's a volunteer position, of course. Very collaborative, very..." She paused. Visible. There it was, the invitation to her inner circle. Join up, play ball, and maybe your truck suddenly becomes compliant. The scent of that manipulation was as sharp as the cedar mulch she'd recently had power blown across her entire front yard. A smell I will associate with petty corruption for the rest of my life. I declined. 2 days later, I got a certified letter informing me that my account had accumulated $1,400 in outstanding fines, and that if not resolved within 30 days, the HOA would pursue a lien against my property. A lien on my house, over a toolbox. Now, here's the part that a lot of people don't know, and Phyllis absolutely knew and was counting on. HO, as in Texas, and in most states, actually do have the legal authority to place liens on properties for unpaid assessments and fines. That part is real. What she was counting on was that I'd panic, that the word lien would make me fold, cut a check, and drag myself to her beautification committee like a man asking for mercy. She had the wrong guy. I didn't fold. I escalated. I got Walt to file a formal dispute with the HOA's own internal appeals process, which, under Texas law, they're required to have and to honor. While we waited for that hearing date, I did something Phyllis didn't anticipate. I started talking to every neighbor who would listen, not ranting on social media, not posting angry flyers, just knocking on doors, having coffee, listening to stories. And Lord, did people have stories. In a neighborhood of 74 homes, I found 11 households who had received what I would generously call questionable enforcement letters over the past 3 years. All of them targeted. All of them either newer to the neighborhood, working class, or simply not in Phyllis's social orbit. I asked each one a simple question. Would you be willing to put that in writing? 7 of them said yes. Phyllis had just given me something far more dangerous than a fine. She'd given me a coalition. Now, Phyllis wasn't stupid, calculated, manipulative, deeply committed to her own myth. but not stupid. She noticed me talking to neighbors. She noticed that Harlan had stopped turning his flag down when she walked by, which in retired firefighter language is a very specific message. She noticed that the Vespers had started attending HOA meetings they'd previously avoided, sitting in the back row with notepads. So she evolved. The next move came not from Phyllis personally, but from the HOA's management company, a firm called Sunrise Community Management out of Cedar Park that Phyllis had contracted about 18 months earlier. They sent a letter informing me that pursuant to HOA Bylaw Article 6, Section 3, which I'll be honest, I had not yet read in detail, the board had the authority to retain legal counsel at the community's collective expense and pursue court action for unpaid fines. The message was clear: pay up, or this gets expensive for everyone. And if it gets expensive for everyone, guess who your neighbors are going to blame? That was a genuinely clever move. Weaponize the community against me by threatening to drain the community treasury in a lawsuit I supposedly caused by not paying my truck fine. Classic SLAPP-adjacent thinking. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. SLAPP suits are when powerful parties use the threat of expensive litigation to silence or exhaust smaller opponents. You can Google SLAPP suit. Most states have anti-SLAPP statutes, and Texas is one of them. Takeaway: if an HOA threatens ruinously expensive litigation to silence your legitimate dispute, research your state's anti-SLAPP statute. It can get frivolous lawsuits dismissed fast and shift attorneys' fees back to the bully. Walt looked at Article 6, Section 3, and immediately flagged two problems. First, the board had never held the required membership vote before retaining outside legal counsel for anything other than collections. That vote was mandated in the bylaws themselves. Second, the legal counsel they were threatening to retain was Phyllis's brother-in-law, a family law attorney in Austin who had zero HOA litigation experience. That's not legal counsel. That's a relative on a retainer designed to look intimidating on letterhead. We documented both problems, filed a formal objection, sent copies to Sunrise Community Management directly, not just to Phyllis, noting that their company could be named in any counter litigation as a party to biased enforcement. Management companies don't like being personally exposed. The reply came back in 4 days. The legal counsel retention was under review. Small win, not the war. Then came something I didn't expect. Phyllis began going after Donna. My wife is an occupational therapist, thoughtful, patient, not someone who rattles easily. But Phyllis managed to find her professional Facebook page. Donna uses it to share info for her clients and post community health resources, and began leaving comments. Not anything overtly nasty, but pointed. Interesting posts from someone whose household isn't in compliance with our community standards. And, do patients know about the commercial vehicle drama in your neighborhood? That was a move designed to sting somewhere personal. And it worked, not on Donna, who spotted the manipulation immediately, but on me. I felt the particular fury that comes when someone attacks someone you love to get to you. The kind of anger that, if you don't channel it deliberately, will make you do something stupid. I channeled it deliberately. I screenshot every single comment. I had Donna's account settings time-stamped by a notary. We actually went to a UPS store, printed the page with the timestamp visible, and had it notarized on the spot. Is that overkill? Maybe. But notarized records of online harassment carry real weight in Texas civil harassment proceedings. Her comments were documented, preserved, and filed. Meanwhile, our coalition was growing. We'd added 3 more households. A widow named Cecilia, who'd been fined for her mailbox post needing repainting, a repair she'd requested the HOA cover under the community's maintenance fund, per a provision Phyllis claimed didn't apply to her address, and 2 young couples who were convinced, independently, that they'd been targeted because they'd asked about running for the board. 9 households, 9 sets of written statements, 1 very interested attorney, and 1 very suspicious management company that was starting to ask questions about why a small planned community in Central Texas was generating this much internal conflict. The picture was getting clearer. This wasn't just Phyllis on a power trip. There was money involved somewhere. I just hadn't found it yet. 3 months into this fight, Phyllis made what would turn out to be her most consequential miscalculation. She hired enforcement personnel. That's actually what they called themselves in the letter the HOA sent out. A brief notice informing all residents that the board had engaged community standards enforcement personnel to assist with covenant compliance monitoring. No vendor name, no credentials listed, no mention of what authority these people actually had. Just, they exist, they're here, and they have the board's blessing. They drove a white Ford Transit with magnetic door signs that read, Ridgecrest Pines HOA, Community Compliance. The magnets. I noticed the magnets on day one, meaning those signs could come off in under 10 seconds. The two men who staffed this operation were named, according to their laminated badges, Officer Trent and Officer Dale. They wore navy polo shirts and khaki pants, that HOA authority uniform from the opening of this story, and they carried clipboards and phones. They were not law enforcement. They had no police power. They could not detain you, cite you, or compel you to do anything. They were, legally speaking, private citizens on a contract, with the same authority over you as a grocery store loss prevention employee, which is to say, approximately none, unless you're on private property you've consented to. But they acted like sheriffs, and for a lot of residents, especially older ones, or people unfamiliar with their rights, that acting was enough. Harlan, the retired firefighter, watched them photograph his driveway from the street and walked out to ask what they were doing. Officer Trent told him he was documenting a code violation and that Harlan could face escalating penalties if he interfered with compliance monitoring. I asked Harlan later what his response was. He grinned. I told him I had 31 years of fire service and I know the difference between a code officer and a guy in a polo shirt. Then I took his picture. Smart man, Harlan, but the move that put me in genuine cold fury, the kind that settles into your chest and doesn't leave, was what happened on the Thursday afternoon that became the opening scene of this story. I was coming back from a supply run, groceries plus some steel rod stock I'd picked up for a custom gate project. My truck had the commercial toolbox in the bed, same as always. I turned onto Ridgecrest Pines Drive, and Phyllis herself, not Trent, not Dale, Phyllis, stepped into the middle of the road with her palm out. She was wearing the reflective vest over her linen blazer. I want you to picture that. She had a reflective vest and a clipboard, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment her entire adult life. I stopped the truck. Because you stop when someone steps in front of your vehicle. That's physics and common sense. You are in violation of Section 4.2, she said, loud enough for the three neighbors standing in their yards to hear. Your vehicle is not permitted on this street. This is a public road, Phyllis. It is a community road maintained by this HOA and governed by our... It's a public road dedicated to the city of Cedar Hills during the original development plat, which means you have zero jurisdiction over it, and you are currently committing the offense of impeding traffic. That last part wasn't entirely bluffing. I'd actually looked up the plat. The street had been dedicated to the city during development, which meant the HOA maintained it by contractual agreement, but had no regulatory authority over traffic on it. Phyllis opened her mouth, closed it. The clipboard came up like a shield, and that's when we all heard it. The deep mechanical rumble that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The grinding, patient thunder of diesel engines under load. And then, rounding the corner at the far end of Ridgecrest Pines Drive, came the convoy. 7 vehicles. An Army National Guard logistics unit returning from a training exercise at Camp Swift, taking a permitted route through the residential street to reach their staging area. 5 LMTV cargo trucks, a command Humvee, and a fuel tender, each one the approximate size and weight of a municipal bus, each one bearing U.S. Army markings, each one needing to get through the road that Phyllis Drummond was currently blocking. The lead Humvee stopped about 40 feet back. The passenger door opened. A sergeant first class climbed out, surveyed the scene. Woman in reflective vest, truck blocked, neighborhood audience, and walked toward us with the unhurried confidence of someone who has resolved more complicated situations before breakfast. "Ma'am," he said, "I need this road clear, now." The clipboard lowered. For the first time in my 2 years at Ridgecrest Pines, Phyllis Drummond looked genuinely small. Phyllis moved. Reluctantly, stiffly, like a queen vacating a throne at gunpoint, she stepped to the curb. The convoy rolled through. All 7 vehicles, each one rattling the mailboxes, the diesel exhaust hanging in the cedar-scented afternoon air like a blue haze over a battlefield. When the fuel tender cleared the street, every neighbor in earshot was still watching. The sergeant first class, whose name, I'd learn later, was Torres, glanced back at me as he returned to his Humvee, gave a single nod, and they were gone. 40 seconds maybe, just long enough to completely dismantle Phyllis's theater. But here's the part that changed everything. That evening, I was at Walt's office going through the HOA's financials, which, under Texas Property Code Section 209.005, homeowners have the right to inspect. If you're in an HOA and you've never requested a copy of the financial records, do it, right now. Google Texas HOA Financial Records Request and print that statute. What we found in those records was not subtle. Over the past 22 months, the HOA had paid $47,300 to a vendor called Cedar Pines Property Services for landscape consultation and community beautification planning. Cedar Pines Property Services was not a landscaping company. It was an LLC registered in Travis County, and the registered agent was Phyllis's husband, a man named Ronald Drummond, who operated a small land surveying firm. In other words, Phyllis had been funneling HOA dues, our dues, everyone's dues, to a company owned by her husband, a company that, as far as Walt and I could determine, had produced exactly 0 documented deliverables for the HOA. No site plans, no consultation reports, no before and after photos, no invoices with line items, just $47,300 moving from the HOA account to an account connected to the Drummond family. That is not an aggressive interpretation. That is, on its face, a textbook conflict of interest, and potentially criminal self-dealing. Under Texas Penal Code Section 32.45, misapplication of fiduciary property, a fiduciary who misapplies property they hold for another person's benefit can face criminal charges ranging from a Class A misdemeanor to a second-degree felony, depending on the dollar amount. At $47,300, that's a felony range. Takeaway: request your HOA's financial records immediately. Unexplained vendor payments, especially to related parties, are a major red flag for self-dealing and potentially criminal fraud. Walt sat back in his chair and looked at me over his reading glasses with an expression that was 1/4 concern and 3/4 professional excitement. "Garrett," he said, "this went from a neighbor dispute to a potential financial crime." I nodded. "We have to be careful how we use this," he continued. "If we go loud right now, she buries the records or transfers the money and we lose the leverage. We need to build the full case first." "How long?" 4 to 6 weeks. We document everything. Financial records, the enforcement history, the harassment pattern, the Donna situation, all of it. We bring in a forensic accountant for a 1-day review, probably $800, but worth it. And then we don't just beat Phyllis, we make sure she can't do this again. I thought about the convoy rolling through that afternoon, about Phyllis stepping back to the curb, about the way all those neighbors were still watching. 4 weeks, I said. Let's build the trap. The next month was the most methodical 4 weeks of my life outside of Army logistics. And Army logistics, if you've never been around it, is essentially the discipline of moving the right thing to the right place at exactly the right time. No drama, no waste, no telegraphing. That was the model. Phase 1 was the financial documentation. Walt formally requested the HOA's complete financial records under Texas Property Code 209.005, a request the HOA is legally required to fulfill within 10 business days. When Sunrise Community Management stalled on day 9, Walt sent a follow-up noting that failure to comply within the statutory window was itself a violation, and that we would be filing a complaint with the Texas Real Estate Commission, which oversees HOA management companies. The records arrived on day 10, just before close of business, in a banker's box that clearly hadn't been organized since the Clinton administration. Walt hired a forensic accountant named Sandra Price, a former IRS examiner, not a large firm, just a sharp independent who worked out of a converted house in Round Rock, for a flat $950 for a 1-day document review. Sandra went through the Cedar Pines Property Services payments and produced a 4-page memo that used language like, "no documented consideration," and apparent self-dealing transaction, and, most usefully, pattern consistent with misappropriation. That memo was worth 10 times what it cost. While Walt and Sandra worked the financial angle, I was building the community case. Harlan turned out to be a methodical man. Years of fire service do that, and he went door to door with a simple one-page form he'd designed himself. Date of violation notice, description of alleged violation, actual CC and R section cited, whether they believed enforcement was selective or inconsistent. He collected 19 completed forms, 19 households. Out of 74 in the community, that's more than 1 in 4 homes reporting questionable enforcement. Cecilia, the widow who'd been fined over her mailbox post, turned out to have connections nobody had anticipated. Her late husband had been on the County Planning Commission for 16 years, and she still had friends there. She made a quiet phone call and learned something interesting. Cedar Pines Property Services had applied for a county vendor registration 6 months earlier, the preliminary step for bidding on public landscaping contracts. And the application had been rejected because the company could not produce evidence of any prior completed work, which was consistent with our suspicion that the HOA payments had bought nothing but the appearance of legitimacy. Meanwhile, I was building the physical element of the trap. I know that sounds dramatic, and I want to be clear. This wasn't illegal or even close to it. It was simply documentation infrastructure. I mounted 2 high-definition dash cams on my truck, one forward-facing, one rear-facing, that timestamp their footage automatically and upload to cloud storage every 12 hours. I also installed a residential surveillance camera on a post near my driveway, a simple ring-compatible unit, pointed at the street. None of that requires a permit or any special permission. It's your driveway, your street view. The specific trap was this. Knowing that Phyllis or her polo shirt enforcers would try to intercept me again, I had established a recorded chain of evidence. Every approach, every confrontation, every word spoken on or near my property, captured, time-stamped, cloud-backed. Phyllis thought she was documenting me. I had been documenting her far more thoroughly. The second physical element involved the quarterly HOA community meeting, which, under the bylaws, was required to be open to all homeowners, required to include a financial report, and required to include a period for homeowner questions and comments. That meeting was scheduled for 4 weeks out. Perfect timing. We would not confront Phyllis in a one-on-one argument. We would not go to the media or the county without first giving the community the full picture. That was the ethical and, frankly, the most effective move. Give your neighbors the truth, in the place they're all gathered, with documentation in hand, before witnesses. Walt also prepared a formal complaint package for 3 separate agencies. The Texas Attorney General's HOA Dispute Resolution Program. Yes, that exists. Texas AG accepts HOA complaints under Texas Property Code Chapter 209. The Travis County District Attorney's Office Financial Crimes Division and the Texas Real Estate Commission regarding Sunrise Community Management's facilitation of biased enforcement. We weren't swinging one punch. We were setting up a combination, body, head, and waiting for the bell. The smell of sawdust and coffee in Walt's conference room, the quiet scratch of Sandra's pencil on legal pads, the growing stack of manila folders on the table, it all had a particular texture of momentum, the kind that only builds when the evidence is real and the plan is solid. Phyllis had played her game for 3 years. We were about to change the game entirely. With 2 weeks to go before the community meeting, Phyllis began to feel the shift. You could see it in the way she moved through the neighborhood, slightly faster, slightly less direct. The clipboard now held lower and closer to her body, like something to hide rather than display. She'd always had the bearing of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. Now she had the bearing of someone who sensed the walls narrowing. Her first move in this phase was to try to cancel the meeting. She sent an email to the general HOA listserv, which all homeowners were on, claiming that due to ongoing legal matters, the quarterly meeting would need to be postponed until further notice. No specific date, no explanation of what legal matters. Walt had us ready for exactly this. The bylaws required quarterly meetings, full stop. A board president cannot unilaterally cancel a meeting that is mandated by governing documents. Walt sent a formal written notice to all 74 homeowners. Yes, all of them. because the bylaw gave any homeowner the right to call a special meeting with signatures from 15% of households, with 11 signatures already in hand demanding the meeting proceed on schedule. 11 signatures meant at least 15% of the community. The meeting was legally compelled. Phyllis sent a second email calling the notice procedurally improper. Walt responded with the exact bylaw citation. No emotion, just, here is the rule, here is what it requires, here is what we're doing. She had no counter. Then she tried the smear. I found out through one of the Vesper household that Phyllis had been making remarks at her walking group, at the neighborhood book club she hosted, about my history. Vague, insinuating stuff. Something about issues from before he moved here. Nothing specific, nothing provable, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. The Army record, for context, is squeaky clean. Honorable discharge, good conduct medal, 2 commendation medals, logistics expert rating. There is nothing there. She was manufacturing fog. What she didn't count on was that Sergeant First Class Torres, who'd been the one to step out of the Humvee and clear the road, had seen my truck, noticed the Army veteran license plate, and had actually reached out through a mutual contact at the Veterans Community Center in Cedar Park. He'd heard through the grapevine, apparently, about the HOA situation that had been unfolding at the same house where he'd encountered the woman in the reflective vest. He was curious. We had coffee. Torres was stationed at Camp Swift and was active duty, not in a position to formally intervene in a civil matter. He was very clear about that, and appropriately so. But he was entirely willing to be a witness. He'd seen the roadblock. He'd seen Phyllis demand I stop on a public road. He'd heard the exchange. His name and contact information went into Walt's case file that same afternoon. The day before the meeting, Phyllis made what I consider her most desperate move. She filed a noise complaint against my property with the county, citing my welding shop, which, I'll remind you, is 12 minutes away in a commercial bay and has nothing to do with my residential address. The complaint was obviously fabricated, but the intent was transparent. Create a cloud of official-looking complaints around me so that when the community meeting happened, anyone looking up my name would find the complaint. It's a classic bad faith tactic. Create paper chaos to muddy the waters. But here's what she didn't know. The county's complaint intake office timestamps complaints and keeps records of who filed them. That complaint was filed at 9:14 a.m. the day before the meeting. From Phyllis Drummond's verified county resident portal account, filed in direct chronological proximity to an HOA dispute she had financial incentive to suppress. That complaint went into Walt's case file too. By the time the evening of the community meeting arrived, the air in my house had a particular stillness to it, the kind you feel before something significant. Donna had set her coffee mug down with unusual deliberateness. Cole, who is 17, and perceptive in the way only teenagers who've watched their parents fight injustice can be, looked up from the kitchen table and said, "You ready?" I checked my suit jacket pocket, 3 printed copies of Sandra's forensic memo. My phone, fully charged, logged into the cloud dashboard showing active camera feeds. Walt's briefcase in the truck with the full case binder. "Yeah," I said. "Let's go." The smell of the night air coming through the back door was cedar, and something like rain on the way. The Ridgecrest Pines community meetings were normally held in the clubhouse, a converted double-wide on the back lot of the development that smelled of old carpet and whatever candle scent Phyllis had decided was welcoming that quarter. Capacity was about 60 people, standard seating being folding chairs in straight rows, a folding table at the front for the board, and a podium that was exactly 1 notch too tall for Phyllis to look authoritative behind. That night, the clubhouse had more people than I'd ever seen at one of these meetings. 53 residents, by Walt's count. In a 74-home community, that's extraordinary attendance for what's normally a 20-person affair. Word had spread, quietly, that something significant was going to happen. Phyllis knew it too. I could tell by the way she'd arranged the front table, her usual spot at the center, but tonight flanked by Officer Trent and Officer Dale, in their polo shirts, which in a room full of neighbors looked less like security and more like a woman bringing her own audience to a jury trial. Ronald Drummond, her husband, sat in the front row of chairs, which he almost never did. A man in a slightly too formal sport coat sat next to him, who Walt identified immediately by sight as the brother-in-law attorney. The meeting opened with Phyllis's standard welcome, delivered with a warmth that had the structural integrity of a paper cup. She moved through the agenda items briskly: community updates, landscaping notes, a reminder about holiday decoration deadlines, trying to consume time before we reached the homeowner comments section. Walt led her. We weren't in a hurry. When she finally called for homeowner comments, hands went up across the room before she'd even finished the sentence. She called on a woman in the third row first, one of Phyllis's regulars, someone who'd brought banana bread to the last meeting, who spent 90 seconds complimenting the new mulch around the entrance sign. This was Phyllis buying time. Then Walt stood up. Walt Cordero is not a large man. He's medium height, medium build, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of quiet presence in a room that you don't register until he starts talking, and you realize you've been listening for 3 minutes and haven't moved. He stated his name and his role as legal counsel for several homeowners who had retained him collectively. He asked the board for the floor to present a matter of financial concern. Phyllis said the meeting wasn't the appropriate venue for legal matters. Walt said, pleasantly, that under the governing documents, homeowner comments were explicitly permitted to include concerns about financial management. She said she'd allow 2 minutes. Walt said he'd need about 15, and that the homeowners might prefer to hear it now, rather than in a Travis County courtroom. He said it the same way you'd say, "Nice weather today." Calm, informational, absolutely devastating. The room was very quiet. Ronald Drummond, in the front row, turned slightly pale. The brother-in-law attorney put his hands together and stared at the floor. Walt presented it in 3 sections. First, the history of selective enforcement. 19 documented complaints from 17 households, all fitting a pattern inconsistent with the stated C, and Rs. The pattern, not just my story. 17 households. People in this room who'd been through the same thing. Second, the financial records. Cedar Pines Property Services. $47,300. The LLC registered to Ronald Drummond. The absence of any documented deliverables. Sandra Price's forensic memo, summarized in 3 sentences and handed out to anyone who raised their hand, which was most of the room. Third, the complaint package. Filed that day with the Texas Attorney General, the Travis County DA's Financial Crimes Division, and the Texas Real Estate Commission. Not threats, actions already taken. He held up the certified mail receipts. Phyllis stood up. "This is completely inappropriate." "Mrs. Drummond," Walt said, "you'll have an opportunity to respond. I'd recommend doing so with counsel present. The brother-in-law in the front row may not be adequate for this particular situation." I don't know how he knew, but the room did know. Harlan snorted. At least 2 people turned to look at the sport coat in the front row, and the brother-in-law himself looked like a man who dearly wished he'd stayed home. Officer Trent and Officer Dale, to their credit, had the good sense to fold their clipboards under their arms and say nothing. For the first time in years, Phyllis Drummond had no move. She was standing at the front of a room full of her neighbors, holding a clipboard that held nothing, surrounded by documentation she hadn't expected, and flanked by paid help whose authority had just been publicly reduced to a punchline. The room was absolutely silent, except for the rain that had started outside, a soft, steady Texas rain drumming on the clubhouse roof, washing the cedar smell in through the cracked door. What happened next was not what I'd planned, and honestly, it was better. I'd expected Phyllis to deflect, to call for adjournment, to get legal counsel involved, to drag this out. What I had not expected was for Ronald Drummond to stand up. He stood slowly, like a man whose joints ached and whose conscience ached more. He was a decent-looking man in his mid-60s, actually, gray-templed, the kind of face that probably looked honest in good times. He looked at Walt's handout in his hand, looked at the room, looked at Phyllis, and then he said quietly, "Phyllis, sit down." She turned to him. "Ronald, sit down." She sat, and the room held its breath. Ronald Drummond said, in a voice that had the flat, exhausted tone of a man who had been waiting for something to end, "The payments to Cedar Pines came through me. Phyllis brought it to me as a cost savings, a way to keep landscape planning in-house through my business contacts. I didn't know the HOA accounts were being used this way. I should have." He paused. "I didn't." Was that completely exculpatory? No. Was it complicated? Yes. Was it the kind of statement that changes the temperature of a room completely? Absolutely yes. Half the crowd turned to look at Phyllis. The other half were still looking at Ronald. His wife was staring at a point approximately 6 inches above the folding table, not at anyone in particular, with the expression of a woman whose scaffolding has just given way under her. The brother-in-law attorney leaned toward Ronald and said something under his breath. Ronald shook his head. I had prepared a speech. I actually had notes in my pocket. 3 points. The kind of tight summary I used to give to my unit before logistics operations. I stood up and gave a version of it, shorter than planned, because the room had already moved past where I thought we'd be. I said, "This isn't about me and my truck. It never was. This is about 19 households who followed the rules and got harassed anyway. It's about $47,300 that belongs to this community, and may or may not have gone anywhere it was supposed to go. And it's about what kind of neighborhood we want to live in." Then I did the thing I'd been thinking about since that afternoon with the convoy. I pulled up the dashcam footage on my phone, the rear-facing clip from the afternoon Phyllis had blocked the road, and passed my phone down the front row. It showed exactly what it showed. A woman in a reflective vest, standing in the center of a public road, palm out, while a truck she was trying to stop sat with its hazards on, and behind it, a United States Army logistics convoy filling the entire street, unable to pass. It showed the sergeant first class getting out. It showed Phyllis stepping to the curb. It showed the convoy clearing the road. It wasn't incriminating in a legal sense, but in a neighborhood sense, in the sense of, this is the person who has been telling you she has authority over you, and this is what her authority looks like when it meets something real. It was exactly right. 53 people watched it pass from hand to hand around the room. Harlan watched it and laughed. A genuine deep laugh that had been building for 2 years. The Vespers watched it and gripped each other's hands. Cecilia watched it and put it down very carefully, the way you set something down when you want to protect it. At 9:11 p.m., a motion was made to place Phyllis Drummond on immediate administrative leave from the HOA board, pending investigation. The bylaws required a 2/3 majority of homeowners present to pass. The vote was 48-5. The 5 nays included Phyllis herself, Ronald, the brother-in-law, and 2 of Phyllis's walking group regulars who looked, honestly, like they regretted their votes before they'd finished raising their hands. A motion was made to engage an independent property management firm to replace Sunrise Community Management, passed by similar margin. A motion was made to commission an independent financial audit of all HOA accounts going back 3 years, funded by the HOA operating account. Passed unanimously. Officer Trent and Officer Dale, at some point during the vote, had quietly folded their magnetic sign authority into their transit van and driven away. Whether their services had been formally terminated or whether they simply recognized an exit, I'll never know. But the khaki pants and polo shirts were gone by the time the meeting adjourned. The rain was still falling when we walked out. Steady, clean. The cedar smell was everywhere. Walt shook my hand in the parking lot. "That," he said, "is how you do it." Harlan clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to move me half a step. Donna squeezed my hand. Cole, who had come with us and sat in the back row, was looking at me with an expression I recognized. The one that means someone sees you clearly and approves of what they see. That expression was worth more than all of it. The fallout was significant and honestly satisfying in the specific way that justice porn is satisfying, not because anyone was destroyed, but because accountability actually landed. The Travis County DA's Financial Crimes Division opened a preliminary inquiry into the Cedar Pines Property Services payments within 3 weeks of Walt's filing. That inquiry is, as of this telling, still active. I'm not able to discuss the specifics, but I can tell you that $47,300 in undocumented payments to a related party LLC tends to attract sustained prosecutorial interest. Phyllis resigned from the HOA board formally, in writing, 8 days after the community meeting. No statement, no apology. Just a terse letter that arrived in the new management company's inbox at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, which is the exact timestamp of a decision made in the middle of a sleepless night. The independent financial audit came back 6 weeks later. It confirmed Sandra Price's findings and added 3 additional vendor anomalies, smaller amounts, totaling around $9,200, that were being examined separately. The audit also confirmed that the HOA reserve fund, which was supposed to have about $85,000 in it for capital improvements, had $31,000. The rest had been spent, over 3 years, on items that were either underdocumented or connected to the same small circle of vendors. The new management company, a firm with actual credentials and a track record that didn't include angry homeowners filing AG complaints, restructured the CC&R enforcement process within the first month. All outstanding violations were reviewed. 14 of them, including mine, were formally withdrawn as unsupported by the actual CC&R language. My truck is parked in my driveway right now as I tell you this. Harlan got a formal letter acknowledging that his American flag had always been in compliance. Cecilia got a check for the mailbox repair she'd done herself, reimbursed from the maintenance fund that the CC&Rs had always said she was entitled to use. The Vespers submitted their names for the board. Both were elected at the next quarterly meeting, which had a record attendance of 61 households. The new board passed a transparency resolution requiring all vendor contracts over $1,000 to be disclosed publicly on the HOA's website before execution. Now here's the part that still gets me. About a month after the community meeting, I got a message through the Veterans Community Center from Sergeant First Class Torres. He'd heard through the grapevine, small community, big ears, that the situation at the house where he'd helped unclog the road had resolved. He asked how it went. I told him the summary. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a single line. Glad the road's clear. That's it. No fanfare. Just a soldier who showed up, did his job, and went back to doing his job. But his presence on that afternoon, those 7 vehicles, that unassuming authority, that single unhurried walk across the road, had been the pivot point. The moment the neighborhood saw the curtain pulled back, and I'm grateful for it more than I know how to say properly. The community decided to do something with the energy that had been unlocked by all of this. Cecilia proposed it first, a scholarship fund for Ridgecrest Pines kids going to trade school or community college. Funded by voluntary contributions, independently administered, named the Ridgecrest Pines Community Foundation. Within 8 weeks, $14,000 had been raised from within the neighborhood. First award was given to a 17-year-old 2 streets over, who is studying welding and fabrication. Cole knows him from school. I didn't tell him what I do for a living until the awards ceremony.
And that's how it ended. A woman who spent 2 years treating this neighborhood like her personal kingdom walked out that meeting with nothing. No title, no clipboard, no authority. 48 neighbors brought her out in her own clubhouse. In front of everyone, she spent years trying to control. The $47,300 that was supposed to go toward this community is now in the hands of investigators. And the scholarship fund the neighborhood built from scratch, $14,000, raised by the same people she spent years pushing around, just sent its first kid to trade school. That's not luck. That's what happens when you stop reacting and start documenting. When you know your rights and you're not afraid to use them. Garrett didn't win because a military convoy showed up at the right moment. He won because he's already done the work, the records, the neighbors, the attorney, the evidence. That convoy just made sure everyone was watching when it happened. Here's what I want to ask you, and I mean this seriously. How many of you are sitting on a situation just like this right now? Fake rules, selective enforcement. Someone with a little bit of power using it to make your life smaller. If that's you, drop it in the comments. You might be surprised how many people are fighting the same fight. If this story hit different, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more, because the next story coming up make this one look like a warm-up. Play stupid game with stupid prizes, and sometimes the whole neighborhood wins with you.